Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
I would like to begin with a poem shared in one of my national teaching workshops, and this is a poem I am going to illustrate through a few slides. Is the kind of teacher we need today to teach language through poetry. This brings me to one of the main methods called subject-centered methods. Subject-centered methods are those that directly emphasize the content, form, and structure of a poem. For example, when we talk about the poetics of a poem, we must remember that a poem differs from routine or normal discourse because it comes with a specialized technical language. It is the art form that foregrounds language in its complexity, intensity, and especially in its relatedness. Because in the poetic text, everything is related to everything else, or should be, because the entire content is a construct of sameness and difference in both accurate and equable proportions. Teachers must decide how they will teach the subjects of poetics, metrics, and prosody. Teaching poetry must include a lesson about its technique and formal history so that the texts can be varied and diverse. Any introductory lecture on teaching language through poetry should focus on four main topics: narrative, lyric, satire, and image, as an efficient way to show how poetic language has been generated and developed. In order to understand the special nature of poetry, students must be made to grasp the technical quality of poetic forms. The challenge is to bring alive the idea that poetry exists in the abstract before it exists in particular. The students' resistance to learning poetics is the main impediment in teaching poetry. When we talk about metaphors and similes, many teachers have used these as themes to organize a reading of poetry. The concept of flowers, the connotation of birds in flight, the image of a hawk, the fleeting nature of time, the power of animal pictures and their implications, all these play a major role in the teaching of reading and understanding poetry. Yet another way is genre analysis. Genre analysis is sometimes identified with an older and even an outmoded approach to literature, but it is an effective way to teach poetry. Generic explanations can show how the sonnet flexibly accommodates a range of very different voices over several centuries. The radical Republican voices of John Milton and Tony Harrison, the anguished confessional voices of George Herbert and Gerard Manley Hopkins, the intimate amatory voices of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti. The elegy can be taught by juxtaposing Lycidas with later works such as Odin's Elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats. Thus, any introductory lecture can highlight the various genres and their salient features with illustrative examples. We must understand the importance of background while teaching language through poetry. We must also be a little understanding about the cultural diversity in our classes. Students who do not belong to elite backgrounds or upper middle class families or English speaking native cultures usually need more subject centered training before they can even think about prosody and rhetorical figures. Undergraduates need a detailed study guide and supplementary reading in order to understand and enjoy both Milton and Browning. Students should gain an in-depth understanding of issues of tone, sources of allusions, biblical references, gender references, dialogue, and generic history with reference to specific passages and lines. Many teachers have always described their students as lacking virtually all the extensive historical, literary, mythological, and theological information necessary to even a partial understanding of such a poem as, for example, Paradise Lost. So these students must be given some historical and biographical background, in part because they honestly do not understand why anyone would want to write such a poem, and that too on such a mammoth scale. Now we come to the teacher-centered methods. These are practical and effective methods where the teacher is the focus and uses ways to gain the attention and interest of the class in order to engage them mentally with the essence and evocativeness of the poem. For example, reading aloud. This is a dramatically effective method of teaching poetry because the students follow not just the physical properties of the poem, they can also monitor the pace with which they encounter the words. This method makes the students follow attentively only if the teacher reads clearly, loudly, and correctly. And this method oscillates between reading and hearing. Both the eye and the ear are being used, so only after students have listened to the poem should they move to close reading. However, making the students attempt to read can be embarrassing to the reader and boring to the class. So one must watch and feel the pulse of the classroom before venturing into any teacher-centered method. Now we come to the traditional method, lecturing. While teaching a poem for the first time, a teacher must plan 3 lectures on technique, trope, and emotion. This lecture will be an effort to make the text choices illustrative of the way that emotional and cultural intelligence is transmitted in the poem. For example, T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a very important poem for captivating students. It can begin by raising a detached question of genre and literary history. The poem as a monologue, and this can be traced as descending from Robert Browning. Understanding the techniques of the dramatic monologue brings to light the role of the implied listener. And Eliot says, "Let us go then, you and I." The question implied is, who is the you? An answer lies within the poem, and by the end of the teaching process, students may be able to see that the fragmented subjectivity of the narrator makes both you and I parts of himself. And the ending says, human voices wake us and we drown. By then, you and I have come together. So the teacher must emphasize the beginning and the ending of the poems because the poem is circular and requires understanding of both opening and closure. This must be the main hallmark of the teacher-centered method. integration. Now we come to student-centered methods. These methods are focused on the active participation of the students in the learning process and uses strategies of enhancing student attention, retention, and development of critical analysis of the poem. Teachers can present, explain, and demonstrate the subject matter of poetic analysis and interpretation, but telling the students about it is not the same as involving them in it. Poetry is well suited to the active classroom. In poetry, one can read everything, including the punctuation. Everything, my friends, is an inexhaustible side of reading and interpretation. The potential power of teaching poetry depends on active student engagement with both poetic language and poetic meaning, since there may be multiple connotations, many layers of meanings, and various levels of reader responses. Now we come to the technique of memorizing. Yes, the oldest pedagogical method for teaching poetry is memorization. Many of us will recall having to learn poems by heart in elementary school and even in high school, or memorizing lines and poems voluntarily. Shakespeare's sonnets, Arnold's Dover Beach, Browning's The Pied Piper of Hamelin, or My Last Duchess. So knowing poems by heart was once the hallmark of an educated and well-read person. Today it is regarded as an outdated skill that is fast disappearing. Having students memorize poems seems like a rote exercise and out of place in the modern classroom. Yet, both poets and distinguished teachers of poetry still recommend memorization as a useful pedagogical tool. Why? Because memorization is the first significant step in reading poems. Silent, intensive readings of shorter poems should be followed by recitations to oneself. Once committed to memory, the poem has the capacity of leaving a deep impact on the mind of the reader who recites it. Memorizing allows the reader to experience language, to experience privacy, to experience subjectivity. Because when you are memorizing a poem, you are building an intimate connection with the person who created those poems. It is a profound source of spiritual nourishment. Memorizing is necessary to make the poem a part of the mind, since poems began as a memory system. In its most ancient form, the now familiar features of poetry, which include rhyme, meter, repetition, alliteration, and the like, were simply mnemonic devices, tricks to facilitate the storage and retrieval of information and vital information. The technique of recitation is what comes after memorization. Poems should be read correctly or recited through audio tapes wherein the speaker has meticulous pronunciation, correct articulation, and a powerful diction. Both syntactical units and the line ending must be stressed so that the ear can distinguish between syntactic and structural units. The reader of a poem is not an actor, but rather a musical instrument. Students can interpret, but they also need to understand the rhythm, appreciate the cadence, and follow the melody, because poetic and emotional stresses fall in various places throughout the same piece of writing. Another way of generating interest is by making portfolios of writing about poetry. Many teachers do this, and we should also encourage our students to keep a portfolio of their writings on poems throughout the semester. We can also break down the writing assignments into blocks, geared to helping the less experienced readers to develop a method for first noticing and then exploring poetic language. Towards the beginning of the course semester, the tasks run heavily in locating effects to explore. In the later stages, the tasks can be focused on more sustained exploration and argumentation. For instance, in teaching sonnets, in the final learning outcomes, we can make the students able to develop readings of sonnets as compressed, miniaturized plays, each with characters, a dramatic situation, and a plot. However, the first task given can be very simple, and they can be asked to notice and explore 3 to 5 words that seem to have a special role in the poem, or even, for example, identify the legal metaphors used in Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Another way of teaching language through poetry is by comparison and contrast. One of the most effective ways of showing students how poetic language works is to have them compare a poem with a prose statement of the same theme, or compare 2 or more poems on similar themes. For example, take a short poem like Shakespeare's Sonnet number 18 and put it alongside a suggestive English poem like Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. Observe how these 2 texts elucidate love and time, how they compare the effects of time and love, and how they can be similar in theme. Then we can take something from a contemporary poet and see how the tradition has changed over the years. This can be used to teach poetic structure. Or else we could take 3 sonnets, one each by Wyatt, Sidney, and Shakespeare, and interpret them simultaneously by comparison and contrast. There is another way of teaching language through poetry, and that is by blending the 3 approaches. No teacher has ever used only one of the methods in isolation. In planning and teaching poetry, a good teacher may use many techniques, but the effective teacher will always include active, student-centered and subject-centered techniques rather than teacher-centered methods. The effective teacher will combine personal stories with literary history, film clips with close readings, biography with prosody. In a class discussion on the poetry of Kamala Das, for example, an effective teacher may combine a feminist intellectual framework with careful attention to the conventions and techniques of the verse. The most important part of a discussion class will be the opening question. Who is the speaker and what is her problem? This might look like a simple question, but this is one which in the case of Kamala Das opens out obviously into many larger issues: identity, femininity, stereotype, social expectation, patriarchy, subjectivity, etc. One can then follow up on the poem's imagery and its colloquial elements. This can be further related to issues of modernism, and it can also then be used to introduce biographical, historical, and social questions to be asked what it meant to be a woman born in India at that time in that space, reading major poetry, trying to write major poetry in the years of her growing up. The teacher can then organize a poem like An Introduction by Kamala Das in terms of the articulation of the culturally silenced feminine voice asserting her identity as a statement of rebellion using the genre of confessional poetry. A similar technique can be applied to teaching the wasteland, which is usually there as an item in the curriculum for first-year undergraduate or postgraduate students. We can focus on the theme of failed love, begin with a close reading of the epigraph and the first 7 lines of the poem, providing students with a detailed account of its mythic and literary sources, linking them to the relation between love and fruitfulness, between despair and waste, in the myths of Fraser and Weston, in the Bible, and in a few well-known works in the Western tradition. Overall, the models for teaching poetry, that is, performance, imitation, generic focus, comparison, connection, engagement, evaluation, are traditionally the most hands-on in the literary repertoire of the language teacher. Now I come to the need of today in teaching poetry. Today, teaching poetry, and especially language through poetry, needs special attention. A new strategy must be formed in which the students are made to live the poem and experience it, and are given the freedom of thought and imagination to form personal views about it. Whether, as a teacher, you are starting a poetry unit in language, or you want to integrate poetry into your language curriculum throughout the semester, there are some ideas which can make your poetry classes for language both meaningful and relevant. Before you begin a poetry unit, make sure that your students are familiar with figurative language, such as alliteration, onomatopoeia, simile, metaphor, and personification. Fluency with a thesaurus is a good skill to have. You may also want to use rhyming dictionaries which are ideally available online. You may consider creating a permanent poetry bulletin board in your classroom group. Every few weeks, change the type of poem shared by you, making sure that it contains a different kind of language. Include information about that poetry and some other poets, or maybe some other famous works of the same poets. Another option is to feature a different poet each week with samples of their work. To create a class poetry blog, to use a page from your classroom blog if it has been created just for student poems. Older students or senior students could post their own favorite poems along with an image. Encourage students to comment on each other's posts and poetry. Have them keep a poetry reflection journal. And one way of keeping a reflection journal is to have them collect poems by well-known poets and write linguistic reflections or analyses about them. Another option is to do a more formal poetry reading in a class, choosing a favorite theme or a favorite poem and expanding the same to hold poetry circles in a similar way that we hold a literature circle. Use the teaching of poetry as a time for students to share their favorite poems in groups, because poems are ideal for close reading. And while reading, we must consider rhyming pattern, author's purpose and perspective, mood, tone, interesting words, phrases, themes, etc. We must make students write poet reports. These can be a formal report or a presentation, or we can just have them post a poem of the day or a poem of the week. If they take turns in choosing the poem, they must also give some information about the poet. One of the most important things we must learn as a teacher and transmit to our students is the art of interpretation of poetry. One of the most successful evocations of mood and atmosphere has been the first of Eliot's preludes. The winter evening settles down with smell of steaks in passageways, 6 o'clock. The burnt-out ends of smoky days, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street, a lonely cab horse steams and stamps, and then the lighting of the lamps. How do you interpret this? What do teachers do when they interpret this? Especially something in the usual close reading situation, without making any specific use of linguistic or literary theory. This can be regarded as an indicative idea of what we can do while appreciating such a modern poem in an urban cityscape. 1. we can discern an overall structural pattern or the scaffolding of a structural frame. These can be called macro patterns to distinguish them from the smaller scale patterning. For example, two elements in a poem may be paired and contrasted throughout, and this contrast can be supported by image patterns linked to each other. For example, The Tiger and the Lamb, that is, the two poems from William Blake, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. Once the structural pattern has been perceived, a whole line of interpretation can be built. Second, teachers can look for the apparent similarity beneath the dissimilarity. We can look at two elements like the tiger and lamb first as opposites of each other, but at the same time as complements of each other. They are not contradictory, they are contrasting but complementary. The third, we can distinguish between overt and covert meaning, between apparent content and real content. The outermost and most obvious meaning should be the reading first and then the meaning next. The fourth, the teachers can distinguish between meaning and significance. So what exactly is the difference between meaning and significance? Meaning is something inside the work. Significance is something the readers have to work at to perceive in the work, something which may necessarily be shifting. Significance means a change of thought, analysis, perspective, the same thing being understood differently by different classes or genders. This leads to a surface meaning of seasonal aspects and ripe sensuousness in Keats's Ode to Autumn, and a deeper significance of poignant mortality in the same poem. So when teachers think in terms of genre or literary type and interrogate the ways in which the literary genre affects the content of the work, then we come to a holistic appreciation of poetry that we can achieve and inculcate in our students. For example, does the ballad form intensify the content of Lochinvar, or does the sonnet framework enhance the significance of the content of The Ways of Love, or does the dramatic monologue add dimension to the characterization of the Duke of Ferrara in My Last Duchess by Robert Browning? So we can also analyze poetry by frequently reading the literal as metaphorical. For example, a modern poem mentions a hawk roosting, and this is understood as a metaphor of power, position, supremacy, and callous disregard for the lesser creatures. This kind of interpretive move is very common in the reading of poetry. In spite of this, we read the surface of the work accurately and encourage our students to do so. And in this way, they recognize the importance of the language, the precise literal words of the text, and they do not take liberties with language. For example, Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare contains the line, "Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May." This is a direct allusion to the loveliness of spring, but also a reminder of the harshness of nature. Readers look for patterns in literary works, not overarching structural patterns, but also micro patterns. For example, a series of words with the same tone or register or flavor. Often, the significant point is where the perceived pattern is broken, for the item in question must have been chosen either in spite of breaking the pattern or because it breaks the pattern and is thereby foregrounded. Readers identify stages and phases within a literary work. Some of these are formally marked by divisions, stanzas, quatrains, or verses. Across these, there is a moment when the exposition phase slides into the development phase, and another phase begins when the development has put everything in place for the denouement or the conclusion. The reader needs to be aware of the moment when the introduction of setting and characters pivots into the first significant incident or choice or denial. For example, in Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, it is important to decide whether the three images of aging are meant to represent some kind of progression and development or just three static examples of the same thing. Let us take another example. The poem by Nissim Ezekiel entitled Goodbye Party for Miss Pushpa T.S. The language here is highly amusing, Indianized and incorrect. Errors of grammar and expression showing the colloquial and regional use of adapted English and making it seem that this is the kind of language that is to be used. These are some of the main ways in which readers and critics engage with literary texts and begin to analyze the poems and interpret them. In conclusion, as language teachers, we must acknowledge that teachers will always need these elements of interpretation and analysis of poetry to teach language.